this whole idea of happy. Now, when I say happy, there's a lot of things that come to mind, right? There are all kinds of things that come to mind. In fact, somebody handed me this book this week, 14,000 Things to Be Happy About. And look at how thick this book is. Let me see, there are 612 pages of things that are listed to be happy about. Let me see if I can read any. Beautiful sand patterns, stained glass, picnic groves, movable TV stands. I wonder when this book was written. That's kind of funny. I don't know, we'll see. 1990. Wow, so it's quite a while. Let's see. Beach lunches, slalom racing, the thermos lunch. Oh my goodness. You can be happy about so many things. And so if you're interested, if you're not a happy person, you can come and read this book after the service. You can be involved with that. But what I did this week was I thought to myself, how in the world are we going to launch this thing? Where are we going to go with this whole idea of happy? The reason I wanted to do this, a friend of mine who has gone through some pretty traumatic stuff in her life said, you know what, I've gone to this place where I get into this slump every winter when I'm reminded of this downturn, and then all of a sudden around February I start to kind of pull out of it. I get to this happier place in my life. And then Pharrell Williams came out with that song Happy, and the video that we saw at the very beginning, and a bunch of things sort of worked together in that order, and we said, well, maybe we should do a little series on this and talk about happiness. And the idea stuck, and it came to mind that, you know, where would be some good scriptures that God would speak about happiness and joy, and where is our life going? It's very easy, I think, to focus on the negative, to kind of be pessimistic and look at negative things and how hard life becomes. But I think it's a better turn to look at where joy comes from and where God is. So I did a study this week, and I looked up a few different ideas of where happiness is, and I found a couple blogs. One of them said, the things that happy people do. This is a remarkable list of things that if you're happy, you will do these things. These will be part of your life. There's another list that I found that says 10 easy activities that science has proven that will make you happier today. I love science. I love the fact that science can determine our mood and determine our motives and our methods and our brain. And also these are 10 things that science has said prove to make us happy. And before I hit the list, I want to tell you that on this list, one of the ideas of becoming happy or learning to be happy is the idea of self-acceptance. They said this is on the list, but it's a little bit lower on the list. It didn't really hit the high peak. But self-acceptance is one of the things that a lot of people have a hard time actually practicing. We're so hard on ourselves. We're so self-critical that we always feel like a failure. I don't do enough, or I'm not good enough. And then pretty soon we're not actually that happy. So as it goes on, there's a couple books here listed. The Action of Happiness and Do Something Different. This one author writes about these 10 habits, and I'm just going to list them for you. There's 5 on each page you'll see on the screen, but starting with number 10, the ways to practice happiness is, number 10 is to find meaning, to be part of something bigger than yourself. That would bring happiness. You get out of your self-focus and you think of other things. Here's number 9, acceptance. Like I said, is pretty low on the list. It's not practiced very well, but people, if you accept yourself and learn to be comfortable with who you are, your happiness level can be raised a little bit. Number 8 is emotion. Try to take a positive approach with things. It's pretty hard because sometimes our emotion drives us rather than us choosing logically to drive our emotion. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes things will happen, and other times we try to choose to say, I'm just going to be happy over this. I'm just going to learn to change my attitude. It's a difficult place. Number 7 is resilience. Learn to bounce back from things that are difficult. Number 6 is direction. Try to find goals to look forward to. Set some direction in your life and be goal-driven. There's a biblical word. It's a Greek word, teleos, which means you're driven by the end. You set up goals and you look forward to something that is to come. Number 5 is trying things out. Actually, try new things. Keep learning new stuff. Learn to grow and be renewing your mind. Another thing is appreciating. Take notice of the world. Notice the small things. Notice the seasonal changes. How many of you are a lot more happy now that it's actually not snowing anymore and you don't have to clean your driveway off? I know, right? And then this morning the wind blows and it's raining and it's crazy. But sometimes just the weather is a crazy change. Number 3 is exercising more. Getting out and exercising. A lot of you are fitness people and you love to exercise, and you know that your adrenaline gets going, your endorphins get going, your exercise gets your blood flowing. Number 2 is relating or connecting to other people. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had, even in this church, that just say, people say, well, I'm lonely, or I'm not connected with somebody else. And I say, well, how hard are you trying? Well, I don't know, I just kind of waiting for people to come to me and connect with me. And I'm like, it's a two-way street. We have to try to connect with others, and then others will connect with us. We have to be open to people. And number 1 is this, giving, doing more things for other people. I found this fascinating that the number 1 habit that makes people more happy is actually giving away things, or giving away time, or giving away your life or your purpose, or being able to serve other people. Giving is enormous. This author said that the largest association between these happy habits or being happy is practicing these habits, like learning to actually do the things that are on this list. I have this list printed if you want to see it, or if you didn't get all the notes down, I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards about it. But one of these authors, this Professor Karen Pine, she said practicing these habits really can boost our happiness. And she says the largest one is actually giving things away. We become more happy when we tend to give things away. Have you ever been part of a church where the pastor will give out money and ask you to take that money and give it to somebody else, the pay it forward idea? Has anybody been part of that church? Or a church that does that? I wish I had thousands of dollars to give you each $100 or each $10. Just go give some money away. There's people that'll drive through Starbucks, right? And the person in front of you will pay for your coffee, and then you'll drive up and the person will say, oh no, your coffee's paid for. And then you can either go, well, that was nice, and drive away, or you can go, oh, I think I'll pay for the person behind me. Here's another $5. You know what I mean? And so this pay it forward idea. I was part of a youth ministry conference one time. We went to this big convention in San Diego, and we heard this guy speak. His name is Shane Claiborne, and he got a lot of money for speaking. He got like $5,000 because there were 5,000 of us in the auditorium at least that had come to this thing. And he says, I cashed my paycheck for speaking today, and I cashed it into $1 bills. And I took a stamp that says love in red, and I stamped it on every single dollar. And then he had these bags with him on stage, and he picked up these bags and he started to pour out the $1 bills all over the floor in front of the stage. And get this, he said to all of us youth workers who don't make a lot of money, he said, any of you who wants $1, you could come up and take $1, but you have to give it away. You can't keep it. And do you know how many people came forward? Not very many people. It was mind-blowing. People thought, okay, there's free money on the floor in front of the stage. That guy just gave all this money out, and people were reluctant to go down. A few people did, maybe, 100 or so grabbed some, but out of 5,000 people. And I thought, are we the kind of people that want to hoard what we have, or do we give stuff away? Do we give things away? I think there's this perpetual understanding that if I give things away, then I lose my resources and other people get what I have. Rather than the spiritual idea of if I give things away, God will fill my resources and I can continue to give in God's happiness and God's joy. So all of this intro kind of leads me to where we're going today in the scripture in John chapter 9. This whole idea of the blind man. I love this story because the link to this story is that Jesus gives his life away. Jesus gives healing to this man, and he gives this idea that this man could gain a new relationship with God if Jesus would only tell him, if Jesus would only show him. And so Jesus goes about this idea of telling this person that he could be healed and that he could walk with Jesus, and that it's not about all the religious rules that the Pharisees had laid down. Let me give you a little background of what's going on. So, the Jewish leaders understood that God was moral, right? God is a moral God. He's given us ethics and boundaries and principles all through the Ten Commandments. He gave us all these incredible ideas of how to live our life, how to live with other people, not to murder, to respect your parents, to love God, don't worship idols, all of these things. So the Jews took this in their history and they said, God is a very moral God. So we need to set up a book of rules or formula in order to know how moral we are. Does that make sense? But here's the idea with their formula. Their formula was this. It's a little tainted, but it's very familiar. Their formula was, if you do right, then God will reward you. And if you do wrong, then God will punish you. It makes sense. It's kind of the karma idea that our world lives in. If you do enough good, then good things will return to you. If you do bad, then bad things will happen to you. You'll be punished. So it only follows that with this formula, if disaster were to come into a person's life, then they must have done something really bad. Does that make sense? Mathematically, it would make sense. You do wrong, you get punished. It's kind of the lightning strike idea, when you're talking to somebody and they say something and go, ooh, knock on wood, I hope I don't get struck with lightning. You know all these cliches we say? That's where all that comes from. Here's the reverse side of it. This is also just as bad. Listen to this carefully. On the other hand, prosperity was a sign of God's approval. Do you know why that's bad? It's because if we're prosperous, if we think things are good, then God must be showing favor to me. I must be living right. I must be living in this sort of standard of God. God must be pleased with me. And since He's happy, He's blessing me. Do you know that that's a very careful line to walk? Now that we have Jesus and we have the Holy Spirit and God blesses us regardless, it's very, very dangerous to say, oh, if I just live a lot better, then God will bless me. The dangerous side to that is, do I keep up that hard work in order for God to be happy with me? How long can I play this game? Can you see how this is sort of the mantra of the United States? The mantra of the world. It's kind of the mantra of all these religions that we have in the world, all these different people that say, if I just do enough good, then I should be happy because then God will make me happy if I'm doing enough for Him. Does that make sense? How confusing that can be? But we all live in that. The truth is this morning we can be free from that. We can be happy in a different mindset. And that's why the disciples, when they came to Jesus, they asked Him, who sinned? Was it this man who sinned and he was born blind? Or was it his parents who sinned and made him blind? It's just this very logical thinking, well, he's blind, therefore something went wrong. Therefore, let's try to figure out who went wrong. And Jesus, I love Jesus' comment, he actually says, neither sinned. Let me clarify for you, nobody sinned. It's that he was born this way, and God is going to do this miracle in his life. God says, Jesus said even on the spot, he said pretty much like, I don't think you see clearly. Let me explain to you more clearly how you can see. The blind man didn't have to be a demonstration of the impact of sin. The blind man actually served as a demonstration of God's love, God's power, God's ability to do this work. You know what I call that? God's backdrop for His expression of His love. Sometimes we have these things we're going through, and God says, that's just merely the backdrop. I'm going to do this incredible work in your life. I read about this lady. Her name is Sue. She experienced a painful divorce, and she was deserted by her husband when she was only 3 months pregnant, and she had a 2-year-old living at home, and she struggled for the next 2 years in this brutal loneliness, this brutal desolation, this fear of rejection, this place of, oh, I've got these 2 kids and my husband left me, I've got no purpose in life. Do you think her happiness quotient went down? She was just crushed. But out of that pain and that situation, she grew to understand that she could have sympathy and empathy for other divorced people. She began to see that God never left her, that she has a life and a blessing with God as she just continued to walk in faith. And God began to increase ministry in her. She actually wrote a book about it, how to care for people that were called the suddenly single. And she started a ministry in town and started to actually care for others in her own pain. And what I call that is the backdrop of God's work. God has led a lot of us through a lot of pain. There's some of you sitting here that would say, man, if you could really hear my story, if you really knew what I've gone through, you would treat me different. It would be a different kind of response from you. And some of us hold our story back so tightly because we're afraid that if people find out, if we're really that vulnerable, then we could really get hurt again. But God says, I want to do ministry through you. I want to love you through this. That's what happened with this lady. So Jesus uses this expression of healing the blind man in order to show God's love and God's joy. So I want to get into this a little bit. Do you think that sometimes our happiness quotient is based on our expectation level? Like we expect certain things, and when those things don't happen, our happiness goes down. True? It's a true formula. It can happen. That's what happened with these religious leaders. Let's just take their perspective for a minute. So they're worshiping God. They have all these laws and morals and boundaries, ways to live. This guy named Jesus comes into their temple, into their area, and he heals a man. Of all things, he just goes ahead and heals somebody of their disease. We don't ever see that today, hardly, right? And this man heals, and then the man starts talking about Jesus. So they got to quiet the man. They take him and they start to harass him. They start to kind of figure him out and tell him who's right and who's wrong. And let me give you some background of why this happened or where this happened exactly. So if we rewind the tape just a little bit and we jump into chapter 8 of John. Chapter 8 starts out and Jesus is teaching in the temple. Do you remember this story where the Jews catch this woman in adultery, in the act of adultery? I don't know if she was caught in adultery or was set up for it, but they drag her out half naked in front of Jesus, in front of the town where Jesus is teaching, and they say to Jesus, okay, religious guy, who did wrong? Like, what are we going to do? It says in the law that we should stone this woman. She's committed adultery. She's committed a sin. Let's throw rocks at her. That was the moral code back then. And if you remember this story, or if you have seen Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion, there's a flashback of when this woman is saved by Jesus, and Jesus draws this line in the sand. It's very powerful in the movie. It's kind of a reminder that Jesus is drawing lines. And he's not really drawing lines for the Pharisees. He's drawing lines for the woman to say, woman, this is how much God loves you. I want to express to you this. And he stands up, and you remember this line he says to all of them with stones. He says, he who is without sin may what? Cast the first stone. And you just, in your mind, you imagine all these leaders just dropping stones and walking backwards and kind of moving away. And here's a little historical context on what happened in that moment. So, actually, in John chapter 7, it says it was the Feast of Tabernacles. This was the week that the Jewish community would come together for a whole 7 days, and they would build tabernacles or tents, if you will, these makeshift kind of tents. Have you ever gone to a festival or a park or a Cinco de Mayo or something, and you see these craft tents built today? Like these little pup tents that people sell their crafts and their wares. That's kind of like Feast of Tabernacles. There were all these tents all over the place, and people would worship at the temple, and then they would stay in their little tent for the week. And the whole idea of the week was to remember the days when the Jews walked through the desert with Moses for 40 years. It was a way to remember that God would set up the tent in the Old Testament. He would set up this tabernacle. They would feast. They would have food. They would celebrate the fact that they're no longer living in this desolation away from God, but they had this relationship with Him that was different. They had a temple that was built now. They would celebrate this feast. So Jesus comes on the scene. He walks in Jerusalem. He starts to teach in the temple. Then the woman is caught in adultery. She's brought out, and Jesus says, well, if you're without sin, you can throw a stone. Jesus is likely the only person that could have thrown a stone, right? And he doesn't throw a stone. He says, woman, I forgive you. Go away from your life of sin. Here's a question for us. Maybe we should have a Feast of Tabernacles, a time where we remember where we felt like we were in the wilderness too. Do you ever have a time in your life, a low point where it felt like the desert? Or it felt dry. It felt like wilderness. Maybe you were lonely. Maybe you had gone through a divorce. Maybe you've gone through some incredible pain. And you remember that Jesus was there the whole time. Maybe we need a Feast of Tabernacles, a time to remember that God is always there and He's always providing. Okay, here's where it goes in the feast. In this Feast of Tabernacles, there was always this day where they would set up these lamps. And lamps in the day weren't run by electricity. They were run with oil. And they would light the oil on fire. And so they'd pour this oil into these lamps, and they would go down these long channels, and there would be these candle places, and they'd light this thing on fire, and it would light up the evening. Right in that moment, Jesus says in John chapter 8, He says this, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus is looking at all the lamps being lit, and He's looking at actually how temporary those lamps are. And He takes a live, living example, metaphor, object lesson, and He says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness again, but will have the light of life. You know why that's important? It's because lamps go out. The oil can run dry. There can be a time in our life where we feel like the good has come and there's this great light and this temporary light, but it's temporary and then it goes away, and sometimes our emotions swing back down and we'll hit this low again. And Jesus says, I am that light in the world. I'm greater than any temporary experience you could ever possibly have. And then Jesus goes on in chapter 8 and He gets in this argument with the Pharisees about who was old enough or who's right enough. Or Jesus says, I am one with the Father. In fact, before Abraham was even born, I am, Jesus says. That didn't go very well for the Jews. They were like, excuse me, what? You're talking about our great Father and you're greater than Him? They get into this crazy riff-raff argument. And Jesus, He says, I am. And He knew walking in that this would be the end for Him. This is the beginning of the end. But get this, Jesus says, you're living in darkness. You light these temporary lights to celebrate God's remembrance, God's renewal, but those lights go out. He says, I am the light of the world. It'll never be dark for you. If you follow me, we can have this happiness, this joy. That's where the idea of happy comes from. All right, that's all context. Here's a question for you this morning. Where does your happiness come from? Where does your joy come from? Some of us are experiential people. We love experiences. We love to go climb mountains or mountain bike. I love to golf. I love to be outdoors. Some people find their happiness in circumstances. They love the good when the good happens. They don't like the bad when the bad happens. Some people find their happiness in money. Some people say, well, if I just can collect enough, I've got more security there. Some people find their happiness in relationships. Some of you are harmony people, where you love to just have everything in harmony, and I don't want to have any conflict, and if everybody's just happy, then we'll all be better, right? I'm one of those. Some of you are, you seek your happiness in your job satisfaction. Oh, if I have enough purpose in my job, if I feel like I really have enough purpose, then I'm more happy. Some of us are happy with our health. The very fact that we can see, the fact that we can stand up, that we can be out of the hospital, that we can be healthy. Some of us feel like that's where my happiness is, if I just stay free from pain. Some people find their happiness in escaping all the pain and taking substances and trying to cover their pain, right? Happiness is found in all kinds of really crazy places. Remember, Jesus said these things. If you follow me, I'm the light of the world. You'll never walk in darkness. I think sometimes the question for us is where our happiness comes from is, are we close enough to Christ? Are we following Jesus enough to say, Jesus, you really are who you are, and you've come that I might be a different person? We're going to get into that in a minute, but I like to journal. I like to write in a journal. I have a journal at home that looks a lot like a Bible. In fact, it's got graph paper. I bought it at Barnes & Noble. It's almost this shape exactly. When I spend time with the Lord, when I spend time listening or reading a devotion, I like to write down a thought here or there and kind of keep a journal. And I got a friend from Seattle who noticed one time, we used to walk around a lake every week and pray together, and he used to notice how high my highs would get and how low my lows would get emotionally. And he said to me one day, he goes, Reid, you've got really extreme highs and really extreme lows. What's going on? I said, I don't know. God may be that way. I can't control that. He goes, but are you journaling that out? Are you close to God when you're incredibly high? I said, yeah, like when life is going great and all these circumstances are great around me, I like to journal and tell God everything. He goes, what do you do when you're extremely low? I said, I don't know. I probably don't journal so much. He goes, let me see your journal. I said, I don't want to show you my journal. This is private. You know what I mean? You kind of like, I want to show you this. He goes, no, let me see it. He started flipping through the pages, and he's like, oh, looks like you haven't written in here for a while. What's going on? And he noticed that when I get low, I don't spend as much time with the Lord. It's like, oh, man, I got to figure out my own problems myself. And he convicted me. He says, Reid, the closer you spend time with the Lord, the more you listen to what the Holy Spirit's doing to draw you, the closer you are with him, the more your happiness can draw up. Why? Because God is the answer for things, not your circumstances. So I want to give you 3 practical ways to find happiness out of this little chapter of John chapter 9. So if you like notes, if you're a note-taker kind of person, if you like to fill in the blanks, these are just 3 simple ideas that I found out of the story that I thought would raise a little bit of happiness for us, or at least get us to that point. So number 1 is, externals aren't everything. Joy begins in encountering Jesus. Let me say that again. For the blind man's perspective, no pun intended, but externals aren't everything. We tend to put all of our happy weight on externals. Do you know what I mean? We look for when the circumstances are good. Did I get any money back on my tax return? Was I able to, did I get the car that I wanted? Did I get the external stuff that I wanted? Are my relationships going good? All the external things. Do you know what I mean by that? So if you look at the blind man, do you know when his problems started? It was when he got healed. How about that? Isn't that crazy? When he got sight, that's when all of his problems started. You know why? Because people said, you're really not that blind guy. I think that was somebody else. And they dragged him in front of the Pharisees. And then the Pharisees asked him 3 times, well, how did you get healed? He goes, I don't know. Some guy just made some clay. So he didn't know it was spit. He probably didn't hear Jesus spit, so he just thought it was water and mud, and he just put something on my eye. I don't know, I can see. Do you remember at the end, he goes, why are you asking me so much? Do you want to follow this guy too? Do you want to be his disciples? I love that. He's got a little bit sarcastic in there. But his problem started when his externals changed. And Jesus actually started down the road of going toward his crucifixion when his externals were changing. His people around him started to doubt him. People started to say, well, you're kind of talking like you're somebody else. And they started to accuse him and go after him. So number 1 is our externals aren't really everything. We need to find where our joy comes from, and it comes in this encountering of Jesus. Have you really encountered Jesus? Number 2 could be this. Miracles can be deceiving. However, Jesus is worthy of worship. Maybe I need to say that again in another way. Sometimes we look for the miracle in order to find our happiness. We want our marriage to be resolved. We want our kids to come back into the home. We want to be resolved financially. We want to be able to amend that conflict. We want the miracle to happen. And sometimes we lose that Jesus is just worthy of worship enough. We look for how God will answer a problem, and we begin to worship the God who only provides good things. Do you know the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000? Jesus fed all these 5,000 people. It was probably 15,000 people he fed with loaves and fishes. They were hungry for 3 days, and he finally fed them. Have you ever gone a day without food? You know how hard that is? You get hungry. Have you ever gone 2 days? 3 days? Do you know how hungry you are? And Jesus provides this food, and then all of a sudden, he had all these followers. Do you know what they were really following? The food. They were following the fact that Jesus could do a miracle. And so sometimes we look to the miracle instead of looking to Jesus. One of my favorite verses in here is verse 38. It says this. It says, and then Jesus said, and then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. The man actually worshiped Jesus, not just because of the miracle, but because Jesus said, I'm the Son of Man. And here's number 3 is, your unhappy life situation could very well be the backdrop to God's blessing. Sometimes we want our life to just be better and have a better life situation, and we want everything to be fixed. We want our marriage back, and we want the vehicle back, and we want everything back. Have you ever heard a country song backwards? Everybody gets all their stuff back, you know? That's that song. And you get your porch light fixed, and you get all this stuff that was broken. That's what I've heard about backmasking a country song. But here's the deal. Sometimes our unhappy comes from broken promises, or our unhappy comes from our lack of being fulfilled, our lack of purpose, our lack of enough money, our lack of resources. And do you know when I really get unhappy? That's true confession here. When I really get unhappy is when I don't get what I want, when I want it, and how I want it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So here's the deal. If I don't get what I want, and it didn't come in time, and it's not how I wanted it, then I'm unhappy. Can I give you the bad news? The bad news is even when I get what I want and how I want and what I want, I'm still sometimes not happy. So my joy isn't found in in the stuff. My joy is found in who God is. It's a chronic slippery slope. It's kind of the way the religious Jews had their formula. You do enough good and good things will come back. We can't live by that. In fact, the way we can live is this. It's Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it in you. God actually has this purpose for you. He's completing in you. He's walking you through this motion where you move closer to God, and God is the one completing a work. It's hard for us to let go of that work and say, I just need to find my happiness. And God says, wait, I'm working on that. Just give me some time to develop this foundation with you. I think one of my favorite lines in this whole text is that it says, Jesus went out and he found the man, after the man was kicked out of the synagogue. He found the man, and then he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you believe now? I mean, the miracle happened. There really wasn't a lot written about how much he could see, but he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? He went out and found him. Jesus is still on mission, and he's finding people, and he's drawing us in. Jesus is a giver. Maybe he read that list at the beginning, that out of the 10 things you can do to find happiness is you give things away. I think Jesus was a giver. Let me tell you this one last story, and then we're going to do something special in our church this morning. Something happy. I like this wasn't happy. Okay, I shouldn't say that. But I went to a conference just this last week, and I heard one of our seminary speakers. He came from Chicago, and he came out and he spoke to us, and he said this. He says he was a math major in college. So he studied math. He's a mathematician. If any of you are mathematicians, you would have heard this. He talked about a boundaried set. If I had two hands, I'd draw a square. He talked about a boundaried set in math. And a boundaried set is when you kind of have these parameters and everything fits in a box. And everything moves toward the box, and the box determines the answer. Everything that moves toward a boundaried set. He said the converse, or the opposite, is a centered set, where it's not just the box that determines the parameters, it's the fact that it is the center of the solution, and everything else moves towards it. It's not a boundary that everything has to stay out of that. And he was talking to us who weren't mathematicians, just theoretically, and he's saying, sometimes all of us will be like the Jewish leaders, and we'll put things in boxes. We'll put morality in boxes. And other times, we need to put Christ at the center, where Christ heals the blind, Christ gives freedom, and he allows people to move toward him. You'll notice at the Feast of Tabernacles that nobody was really moving towards God. They were just keeping their religious practices. And this person said, in a centered set, we move more towards God. Maybe our happiness comes more from, instead of having expectations of how happy I am, we say, well, am I moving closer to God? Am I growing more in my faith? Am I developing more of a life walk with Jesus? That's where our happiness comes from. We're going to do something special. I'm going to ask Michael and Stacy to come up here. Michael and Stacy Brinklow were married 20 years ago, and they want to renew their wedding vows this morning with all of us as a church. Is that cool?
Yes.
So here's the background story. You guys can come up here. The background story is this, that Michael and Stacy got married 20 years ago, and Michael was not a believer in Jesus. He didn't have a faith walk with the Lord. And so just a few years ago when he met the Lord and his life turned over from being an alcoholic, being addicted to things that were driving him away from his wife, driving him away from any purpose in life, and driving him to a place of desolation. Now he has found the Lord, and he says, I want to renew our 20-year wedding vows in front of the church and say that I'm committed now in my faith as a believer to this marriage. How about that? Woo! So, I'm going to read a scripture, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. Is that okay? The scripture is Ephesians 5, verse 25 to 30. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to be present to her, to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Michael picked this scripture for me to read this morning because it's really an expression of their love for each other. It's also an expression that marriage is really an example, an illustration of the church being in love with Jesus. Jesus being in love with the church. So in your marriage, you don't necessarily kind of merit-base your love. I love in 1 Corinthians 13, it says, love keeps no record of wrongs. Did you know that? Ugh. So we can't keep score. That little score sheet that you keep, well, she never did this, or he never does the dishes, or you can't say that because love doesn't keep score anymore. So when we come together to renew these vows, we're saying that this is really an expression of God's grace in God's church, his love for us. So I'm going to read some vows, and I'll just have you say, I do. Yeah, okay? So Michael, I'll start with you. Michael, will you take Stacy to be your wife? Will you promise and covenant before God and these witnesses to be her loving and faithful husband, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?
I do.
All right. And Stacy, will you take Michael to be your husband? Will you promise and covenant before God and these witnesses to be his loving and faithful wife, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?
I do.
Awesome. That's good. Well, let me pray for you both. Will you all pray with us? God, we thank you for this couple. We thank you for the renewal of their vows. God, their promise together to covenant, to walk with each other.
It might seem crazy.